Hello and welcome back. This is another week, another topic, and this week we'll be talking about network defense. So a little bit more on the defense, maybe a little less on the offense like we've been doing until now. But it is what it is. It's all part of the cybersecurity game. In this first video, we'll explore networking. We'll do a quick review of what networks and network architectures look like. Then we'll have video 2, in which we look at traditional or more commonly found network defense technologies. Video 3 talks about active defense, and then video 4 will look at some related concepts and maybe some emerging topics. So when we started out this semester, which sounds like and feels like an eternity ago, we looked at networking and we explored how we have those multiple layers in the network stack. And particularly what we focused on was how we can abuse networking protocols to disrupt or gain access to data as it's flowing over a network. And particularly, we looked at layer 2 man-in-the-middle attacks, which have a potential to be almost undetectable unless you really know where you're looking. We looked at things like rogue DHCP servers, and we explored some other topics. So that was an offensive perspective. This week we'll take a more defensive look. And what we're trying to accomplish is figuring out how we can design a network and equip that network with technologies that will help us prevent, and also if we can't prevent them, detect attacks as they are happening. So first of all, let's review some principles. These are not necessarily specific to network defense. Any good security or defensible system can adhere to these. But some of these things will include defense in depth. And that means that you should never rely on just a single protective countermeasure to hold off an attacker. We never want a single point of failure. We want to be able to develop multiple layers, that all layers will have to fail for an attacker to gain access to protected infrastructure, and not just one. At some point, there might be too much happening, but in any case, you always want to have several layers at minimum. On those layers, we also want to minimize our attack surfaces, and that means that we should not have any unnecessary surfaces open and exposed. Typically, and we are getting better at it, we want to really actively go in and remove from especially a production level computer what we do not need. Most servers, for example, don't need a fully fledged compiler or scripting language on there. They do need maybe local port filtering or firewalling capabilities. That most servers don't need to have client software installed, like an FTP client, which shouldn't be used in the first place because it's plain text, but there's no reason for it to be there. And Netcat, all of those tools shouldn't be there. Not having those attack surfaces does not prevent an attacker from being successful, but it does make their life harder, so why not do it? You don't need it, get rid of it. Do not activate things you don't need just for convenience, and clean up after yourself. And lastly, we want to look at our systems closely. We want to look at our networks and see if they are behaving the way that we expected them to behave, or at least how we want them to behave. And that's something we want to be doing ongoing, on a continuous basis. This is called network security monitoring, and it basically means that we're collecting data about the behavior of the systems on our network and compare that behavior to data that we know to be expected behavior. If we see anomalies, we'll go investigate. Remember when we talked about networking, we had these two reference models, the OSI stack, which contains 7 layers, and then the TCP/IP stack, which really contains 4 layers, but they map more or less cleanly to each other. And in practice, we use the TCP IP stack for just about anything we do. At the highest level of abstraction, we see the application layer. Sample protocols are HTTP, DNS, SMTP, SSH, all of those application protocols live at that high level of abstraction. But we can't just send that information between systems, we need to encapsulate that. So for example, our application layer protocol, let's use HTTP for the web as an example, would typically be wrapped in a transport layer protocol. TCP, or if you want to use the quick protocol, UDP, but that means that reliable delivery in case of TCP between processes is something that is taken care of for you as an application layer programmer. You don't have to worry about that. The transport layer itself doesn't worry about things like how do I get my bytes from one computer to the other. It does that at a lower level, the internet layer. And that's typically where we find IP. At the IP level, we only care about getting data from one computer to the other. And then once it gets at the computer, we'll look at it and we'll see that there is a transport layer that also contains an application layer, but computer-to-computer transmission is just the internet layer. And then lastly, the internet layer actually sits on top of the network access layer. Things like Ethernet or Wi-Fi live there, and that makes sure that we can communicate bytes between computers. The distinction is important because it depends on where we put our protective controls. We already saw that at that network access layer there really is no security built into the infrastructure. So that means that if we're going to secure that, we're going to have to do that at higher levels. If we talk about data packets, data units at those different levels, they all have different names. If I'm dealing with the physical layer, all the way closest to the physical devices, those are bits. Then on the media access layer, those are called frames. The network layer, they're called packets. And lastly, at the transport layer, we call them datagram. There's really no separate term for the application layer itself. Go with it, listen to the words we're using. That is usually an indication as to what level of abstraction we're talking about. As a reminder, when we talked about this previous, both in the beginning of this semester as well as in CSE 280, the Introduction to Cybersecurity, two computers that are connected to the same local area network can communicate directly using their network devices. And those network devices are typically addressed with a MAC address. They could communicate directly using just that. They would not need IP or TCP on top of that. But in practice, it is highly uncommon. There are very, very few layer 2 protocols that are actually in use. But if those computers are all connected to a single wired network, particularly, although a wireless network has the same concept, they share a broadcast domain. And that means if I'm broadcasting at that layer 2 address, all computers connected to that same device, that same network, will receive that message. If I'm doing that between devices, that might also be the case, but it isn't always so. Now, that's not always desirable. Sometimes you want to have two virtual networks on a single switch, and we can do that. We can carve up that switch into multiple virtual switches, and those are called VLANs, virtual local area networks. And that means that even though all of those devices might be connected to the same switch, if they are on different VLANs, they do not share a broadcast domain, and that means that they cannot see each other, at least not directly without going through some form of infrastructure. Now, VLANs can also span multiple switches, which means that I can link switches together, and as long as those switches share a VLAN, doesn't really matter what switch you're connected to, as long as you're on the same VLAN, you'll still share that broadcast domain. I'll show that in the next picture. So here it is. I've drawn out three switches. I've colored in the switch ports that are numbered, and the idea is that similar colors mean the same VLAN. So if we look at the first switch on the left, that's this one over here. I just highlighted it. We see that VLAN 1 is green, and it's the only port on that switch. VLANs 2 and ports 2 and 3 are yellow, so they share a VLAN between this switch here and this switch here. 2 and 3 are the same. 4 and 5 here and here are also the same. And 6, 7, and 8 are also the same on both switches. So for example, if I take a look at this computer and this server here, they are part of VLAN yellow. And that means that they can communicate directly with each other. They don't need any infrastructure. This laptop over here is connected to VLAN blue, port 6 to be specific. And over here we see a printer and another computer also connected to VLAN blue. And that means that these three devices are able to communicate directly. These switches uplink to each other or downlink to each other depending on what direction you're looking in, but they share the VLAN. Typically what you would see is that those ports, the green ones, are trunks, which mean they can carry multiple VLANs at the same time. And this is very useful if we're dealing with organizations. For example, if we look at our organization, we see that in a single building, we can easily have 10, 15 switches. And it would be unfortunate if not all computers in even the same room, if they're not connected to the same switch, they wouldn't be able to communicate. So we use these VLAN technologies to, on the one hand, break down the networks into smaller pockets so that not too many devices can broadcast on it, but it also helps for manageability. Important concept is VLANs are a layer 2 concept. It's a switching concept. I can simulate or mimic VLANs in terms of subnets, but subnets are a layer 3 protocol. Now we're talking about IP addressing. And so when we're talking about IP addressing, we talk about the network layer. And we know that a computer, a device I should say in principle, or even maybe an interface on a device, can have and maybe will have an address on layer 2 on the network access layer, but it will also have a separate address at layer 3, the network layer. And that's what we're using when we're looking at this level. Now, we just said over here that, for example, the computer on port 2 of the first switch cannot talk to the printer on port 6 because they do not share a layer 2 VLAN. Now, at layer 3, we can put a device in between called a router. And the router facilitates traffic between different subnets. And so, if we want to leave our local area network in order to connect or communicate with a different local area network, we need to go one level up in the IP stack, use those IP addresses, and those get mapped down to the network address layer again. And that's the function of a router, is for packets to traverse between networks. On the outside, you can't really tell the difference between a switch and a router. It's all functionality on the inside. Now, the exact appearance of these devices is not that interesting. So we typically, when we talk about network architectures, abstract away from those particular form factors. And here we see a situation in which we see the circle with the arrows in it. That's a representation of a router. The clouds are typical representations of networks, subnets. And so if we have a router with 4 ports, so for example the middle icon, each of those ports typically has an IP address, and that IP address belongs to a network. For example, over here we might have a network called 1042.17. That means that this port on the router must have an IP address in that network. That means that if someone on this network wants to communicate to someone on this network over here, they first hand their packet at the IP level to this port on the router, and the router will figure out it needs to put it back on the wire on this port, which has a different IP address, so it can go to the final destination. That's what a router does. It's trying to figure out, yep, this is something that's connected to me, and if not, I have a default option. So for example, if I would want to send something to 10.1.2.3, that is not one of the networks connected to this router, so I'm going to send it to my default route, basically kick it down the street, and hopefully someone there will pick it up and get us to its final destination. Network architectures tend to get very complex, especially once you start introducing all kinds of defensive capabilities. How we're going to be doing that specifically is something we'll talk about in video 2. For now, let's keep in mind that what we probably want is, on the one hand, to have our internal assets, so the computers inside our organization that are used for internal use, and separate them out from the computers that are supposed to be facing the internet as servers. So websites for our clients, maybe business partners for remote ordering. You don't necessarily want the internet-facing computers to be able to talk to your internal servers. And that's called network segmentation. In particular, this model where we have the inside of our network connecting through a firewall to go to internet-facing servers. And that's called the DMZ approach, the demilitarized zone, where we don't want these machines, the internet-facing servers, to be able to connect back to the internal network. The internal network can connect out to those, but not the other way around. And then lastly, virtual private networks are a way to create these secure point-to-point tunnels between points on the internet. That way we can protect all of our data in transit through layers of encryption. Those layers will prevent someone from tampering with the data. Those will help us authenticate that we're sending our data to the right person or that it's coming from the right people. And so many organizations will use these VPN services, the virtual private network services, to gain access for remote employees to internal assets. If we look back at our diagram here, as an employee, I would connect to the VPN service, which would create an encrypted tunnel to my internal network. And from that point out, I can access my internal resources as if I am on the network, while someone coming in from the other side will still get stopped by the firewall. VPNs are important, and with today's situation of increased remote working, they are becoming more important. There are many different ways to do it though, some better, some less better. The big deal though is, design your system and figure out whether or not you need them. Most organizations do need them for the time being. VPNs typically do not require specialized hardware on the client side, although there are hardware-based solutions. So they're virtual, they're software-based constructs. Okay. With that, network architecture, routing and switching, we're ready to go on to phase 2 of our video.